Tim, pause here a second before you go in.
I'm headed to the officials' room. What's going on?
We need to speak with you privately before the game starts.
Is this something the crew needs to know about?
To the NBA, Tim Donaghy was a trusted 13-year veteran referee. To federal investigators, he was the man on the floor feeding inside information to gamblers. On games, he was paid to officiate.
No, step with us to the side of the corridor.
All right, but not in front of everyone.
He would not get the chance to walk it back. Within 72 hours, federal agents would seize his phone records, his bank deposits, and a list of coded phrases that two old classmates from Cardinal O'Hara High School had been using to bet against the integrity of every NBA game he worked. 772 regular season contests, 13 years on the most scrutinized officiating crew in American sports, 2 playoff runs, 1 coded word for the home team, 1 coded word for the away team, and 1 referee on the floor of an NBA arena who had decided his picks were worth more than the whistle around his neck. Pay attention to the numbers in this case, not just the dollar figure. Pay attention to how long this scheme ran inside the most watched officiating booth in American sports without a single colleague noticing. Drop a comment with how many games you think were tainted before the FBI walked up his driveway. Subscribe if you're new here. We do this every week, and we don't let these stories get buried. Timothy Francis Donaghy was born on January 4, 1967, at Delaware County Memorial Hospital in Drexel Hill, Pennsylvania. His father, Gerald Donaghy, was a college basketball referee, a serious one. Jerry Donaghy worked Big Five games at the Palestra. He officiated NCAA tournament contests. By the time Tim was old enough to understand what his father did for a living, the family living room in Havertown was already a kind of officiating classroom. Game tapes on the VCR, rule books on the coffee table, striped shirts hanging in the laundry room next to his mother Ann's blouses. Tim was the third of 4 children, the oldest son, the one who would inherit the family trade. He attended Cardinal O'Hara High School in Springfield, Pennsylvania, class of 1985. Cardinal O'Hara was a Catholic boys' school with a serious basketball culture, and Tim played for the team. He was a guard, 5'10", solid build, slightly above average for a Catholic League guard, but never tall enough to play above the rim. His coaches described him in evaluations as competitive, intense, and easily frustrated when calls did not go his way. That last phrase would follow him for the rest of his life. His high school friends included 2 boys who would later sit beside him on the federal indictment. James Battista, nicknamed Baba, a kid from the same parish circle, and Thomas Martino, another Cardinal O'Hara classmate. The 3 of them played pickup games together, bet on Eagles games together, drove down to Atlantic City together once they were old enough to get past the door at the casino floor. After graduation, Tim enrolled at Villanova University. He studied business. He kept refereeing on the side. By his sophomore year, he was officiating high school games in Delaware County, working under his father's reputation and his father's name. The senior Donaghy made phone calls. Doors opened. Tim was 22 years old when he started officiating in the Continental Basketball Association, the CBA, the minor league for NBA hopefuls and for officials hoping to climb. He worked games in Sioux Falls, in Rockford, in Quad City, sleeping in highway motels and eating gas station sandwiches in arenas that held 2,000 fans on a good night. He drove his own car between cities. He was paid a few $100s per game. His evaluations from the CBA describe him as showing strong instincts for game management, decisive on bang-bang calls, and occasionally combative with coaches. One supervisor wrote that Donaghy had the temperament for the highest level if he learned to absorb pressure. It was not a compliment so much as a warning. In 1994, at the age of 27, the National Basketball Association hired Timothy Donaghy as a full-time referee. He was one of the youngest officials in the league. His starting salary was approximately $90,000. By his final season, he would be earning more than $260,000 in base pay, plus playoff bonuses, plus per diem on every road trip. He married Kim, a woman he had known since his Villanova years. They moved south, eventually settling in Bradenton, Florida, in a 4-bedroom house in a gated community off State Road 64. They had 4 daughters. Tim coached his oldest girl's youth basketball team during the off-season. He showed up to school recitals in a polo shirt with the NBA logo stitched on the chest. The neighbors knew what he did for a living. He was the referee on the block, the man who worked Lakers games and Pistons games and flew home to grill burgers in the cul-de-sac. To everyone who watched him from the outside, Tim Donaghy was the success story his father had imagined. He had inherited the trade and surpassed his father in stature. He had worked the NBA Finals as an alternate. He had been on the floor for some of the most televised games of his generation. He had a wife, 4 daughters, a house with a pool, 2 cars in the garage, and a 6-figure salary in a profession most American men could only dream of entering. He also had a gambling problem that had started in college and had never gone away. To understand what Tim Donaghy did, you have to understand how NBA officiating actually works. The league employs roughly 70 referees during a typical season. Every regular season game uses a 3-official crew, a crew chief, a referee, and an umpire. The assignments are made by the league office. The officials do not choose their games. They do not know in advance who they will be working with. The assignments are emailed out the morning of the contest, sometimes the night before, and the crew flies in independently and meets at the arena. The system is built on one foundational assumption, and the entire economic value of the National Basketball Association rests on top of it. The assumption is this: the men in the striped shirts do not have money on the outcome. The league reinforces that assumption with a thick book of rules. Officials cannot bet on any NBA game. Officials cannot bet on any sport at a casino. Officials cannot be in a casino at all, technically, although the league had let that one slip in practice. Officials submit financial disclosures. Officials sign annual integrity affidavits. Officials are subject to background checks before they are hired and periodic reviews afterward. The crew assignments themselves are treated as confidential. The league does not announce the next day's officiating crews publicly. Sportsbooks and odds makers find out which officials are working a given game only after the crews have entered the arena. This is intentional. It is meant to prevent exactly what Tim Donaghy ended up doing. Because every professional gambler in America already knows the secret. Officials matter. Some referees call tight games, and the total points come in low. Some referees swallow the whistle, and the totals run high. Some referees give the home team the benefit of the doubt, and the spread shifts. The crew chief on a Tuesday night game between the Memphis Grizzlies and the Sacramento Kings is, to a serious gambler, a piece of information worth real money. NBA referees also possess a second kind of information that the public never sees. They know which star is nursing a sore knee that he did not put on the injury report. They know which 2 officials in the league have personal conflicts with which players. They know which crew chief tends to give the superstar an extra step on a drive to the basket. They know which assistant coaches scream the loudest from the bench and which ones get ignored. None of that information is public. None of it is available to a gambler in a Las Vegas sportsbook or a bookie's office in South Philadelphia. All of it is available to a referee in the league office break room. For 7 decades, the National Basketball Association had operated under the assumption that the men holding that information would not sell it. The league had compliance officers and integrity affidavits and background checks. But ultimately, the system depended on the personal integrity of 70 men. If even one of them decided to cash in, the entire edifice cracked. In 2003, after he had been an NBA official for 9 years, Timothy Donaghy decided to cash in. The scheme started in conversations. It always does. Donaghy and James Battista had stayed in touch since Cardinal O'Hara. They saw each other at parish events. They met up when Donaghy was home in Pennsylvania during the off-season. Battista had moved from teenage poker games into a career as a professional gambler, working out of South Philadelphia with connections to bookmakers who could move serious money on serious games. Thomas Martino, the 3rd member of the trio, had become a middleman, a delivery man, the guy who carried envelopes between people who did not want to talk to each other directly on the phone. In the months before the 2003 to 2004 NBA season, Battista approached Donaghy with a proposition. Donaghy had been giving informal picks for years over beers, friends bet friends conversations, the kind of thing that happens between any group of men who follow sports. Battista wanted to formalize it. He wanted the picks to be real. He wanted to pay cash. The number Battista offered was $2,000 for every correct call. Nothing if Donaghy was wrong. Donaghy said yes. The arrangement that developed over the next 4 years was clinical. Before any game Donaghy was scheduled to officiate, he would call Martino. Martino would call Battista. They used a phone code. The home team was called Mom. The away team was called something else, depending on the week. The code was simple enough to recite over the phone in a single sentence and innocuous enough that anyone overhearing would assume a man was checking on his mother. Donaghy would say a few words. Martino would relay those words to Battista. Battista would place the bet, usually a 5-figure wager, sometimes more, through bookmakers in the Philadelphia and New York markets. If the pick won, an envelope of cash made its way back to Donaghy. If the pick lost, no money changed hands. What made the picks profitable was not luck. It was information. Donaghy was not guessing. He was reading the conditions of a game that only he could see from the inside. He knew who his crew was going to be. He knew the tendencies of the other 2 officials. He knew which players on which teams had been complaining to the league office about specific officials, which meant he knew which players might get a tighter whistle in retaliation. He knew which stars were dealing with minor injuries that had not been disclosed. He knew which coaches were on the verge of being fired and which teams were playing for nothing. He also knew himself. He knew when he was going to call the game tight and when he was going to let them play. He knew when the totals were likely to come in under and when they were likely to blow past the line. And on certain nights, when the conditions lined up just right, he knew the answer to the question every sportsbook in America was trying to guess. The scheme ran through the 2003 to 2004 season, then the 2004 to 2005 season, then the 2005 to 2006 season, then the 2006 to 2007 season. 4 full NBA campaigns. More than 700 games over which Donaghy held some form of officiating responsibility. Dozens of contests on which the trio bet directly using his inside picks. Nobody noticed. Nobody checked. The league office processed Donaghy's assignment emails and his game reports and his integrity affidavits without flagging anything. His financial disclosures showed no unusual activity because the payments were cash. The envelopes never went through a bank. His income at the league was steady and consistent, and his lifestyle in Bradenton looked exactly like what a referee on a $250,000 salary would be expected to live. He worked the 2005 NBA playoffs. He worked the 2006 playoffs. He was on the floor for some of the most consequential games of his career, while 3 high school friends from suburban Philadelphia were running a coded phone system that turned his crew assignments into wagers. The amount Donaghy ultimately took home in cash payments, according to the federal indictment, was modest by the standards of the people he was working with. Battista was moving real money. Donaghy was clearing tens of thousands per season at most. He was not getting rich off the scheme. He was getting comfortable. He was paying off gambling debts of his own. He was treating the cash as an annuity layered on top of his NBA salary. The picks were almost always correct. Across the seasons in question, the trio's hit rate on Donaghy-influenced games was reportedly between 70 and 80%, depending on how the data was counted. In a market where gamblers consider a 55% hit rate elite, that number was a flashing red light visible from miles away. It just was not visible to anyone inside the NBA. It was, however, visible to the FBI. The federal investigation did not start with Tim Donaghy. In 2006 and into early 2007, the FBI's Eastern District of New York office was running a wide-ranging organized crime probe targeting bookmakers operating between Philadelphia and Staten Island. The probe involved wiretaps. It involved cooperating witnesses. It involved months of patient surveillance on phone numbers connected to individuals who had no idea their conversations were being recorded. One of those phone numbers belonged to James Battista. Agents listening to Battista's calls began to hear something that did not fit the rest of the investigation. He was not talking about football parlays or college basketball totals or the usual array of sports wagering that the bookmakers in the probe were processing. He was talking about specific NBA games. He was talking about which referees were officiating those games. He was talking, in coded language that became less coded the more agents heard it, about getting picks directly from the official on the floor. The agents pulled the NBA officiating assignments for the games Battista had been discussing. The pattern was undeniable. Every game Battista was certain about, every game where his confidence on the phone was unusually high, was a game Timothy Donaghy was working. The Bureau opened a separate file. They began pulling Donaghy's phone records. They mapped his outgoing calls to Martino against his game assignment schedule. The correlation was perfect. Before every game Donaghy officiated, there was a call. Sometimes two, sometimes a brief exchange, sometimes longer. Always Martino on the other end, always within the hour or two before Battista placed a wager that hit. By spring of 2007, the Bureau had assembled enough material to know what they were looking at. A sitting NBA referee was feeding inside information to a professional gambler through a middleman in coded phone conversations, and had been doing so for multiple seasons. The Bureau also knew something Tim Donaghy did not know. They knew that James Battista was beginning to suspect his phones had been compromised. They knew that the network around Battista was starting to crumble. They knew that the timeline on bringing the case forward was short, because once the bookmakers in the broader probe began to scatter, the evidence chain would degrade. In June 2007, federal agents drove to Bradenton, Florida. We are about to walk through how the Bureau actually closed this case. If you have made it this far, you already understand why this case still gets brought up every time a fresh NBA gambling story hits the news. Subscribe if you appreciate this kind of coverage. We do this every single week, and the sentencing on this one is the part most people forget. The evidence the FBI assembled against Tim Donaghy was not circumstantial. It was concrete, layered, and impossible to argue against. The first layer was the phone records. Subpoenas to the cellular carriers produced years of call logs between Donaghy's phone and Thomas Martino's phone, and between Martino's phone and Battista's phone. The calls clustered around game days. The volume increased on days Donaghy was assigned to officiate. The pattern was visible in a spreadsheet. Any analyst could see it. The second layer was the coded conversations themselves. The wiretaps on Battista's phones, captured legally under the broader bookmaking investigation, recorded conversations in which Battista discussed picks that could only have come from a single source. Investigators played the recordings against the NBA officiating schedule. The match was exact. Battista talked about mom on nights Donaghy was working the home team's game. Battista talked about the other side on nights when Donaghy's pick was against the favorite. The phrase mom was the part the federal prosecutors knew would land in a courtroom. It was small. It was personal. It was the kind of detail a jury would never forget. A grown man, a professional gambler with national connections, using the word mom on a phone line to indicate which NBA team to wager tens of thousands of dollars against. The code was the proof. The code told the entire story. The third layer was the financial trail. The cash payments were difficult to trace directly because they had been delivered in envelopes, but Battista's bookmakers had records. The bookmakers had wagering tickets, payout slips, and ledgers showing the size and timing of bets that aligned perfectly with the phone call timeline. The money flowed from the bookmakers to Battista, to Martino, to Donaghy. Most of it never touched a bank, but enough of it did, in small enough quantities to look like legitimate household spending, that prosecutors could draw a credible line. The fourth layer was the statistical analysis. Forensic accountants and gambling analysts working with the Bureau examined the betting patterns on every game Donaghy had officiated during the 2003 to 2007 window. Certain games showed irregularities. Heavy late money on one side, sharp betting movements that did not correspond to any public news event, lines that moved in directions the public action did not justify. Not every Donaghy game was tainted. The trio had been selective. But the games that were tainted had statistical fingerprints all over them. The fifth layer, and the one prosecutors would lean on hardest, was the inside information itself. Donaghy was not selling guesses. He was selling knowledge, crew assignments, player conditions, referee tendencies. The Honest Services Wire Fraud Statute, codified at 18 U.S.C. Section 1346, criminalized exactly this. A fiduciary employee using non-public information acquired through his position to enrich himself outside of his employer's interests. The statute had been written for corporate executives and public officials. It applied just as cleanly to an NBA referee. By July 2007, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York had everything it needed: phone records, wiretap recordings, bookmaker ledgers, statistical analysis, the honest services theory of fraud, the interstate transmission of wagering information. What they did not yet have was a confession. The FBI agents who knocked on Tim Donaghy's door in Bradenton arrived on a weekday morning in early July 2007. Donaghy was home. His wife Kim was home. Two of his daughters were home, on summer break from school, somewhere in the back of the house. He answered the door in a polo shirt and shorts. Florida hot. Driveway baked white in the sun. The agents identified themselves. They asked if he had a few minutes to speak. Donaghy stepped out onto the front porch and pulled the door mostly closed behind him. The conversation, according to subsequent court filings and the recollections of officials present, was brief. FBI agent, Mr. Donaghy, we are here to discuss communications you have had over the past several years with James Battista and Thomas Martino regarding NBA games. Donaghy, I do not have anything to say about that. FBI agent, sir, we have phone records. We have recorded conversations. We are not asking whether the calls happened. We know they happened. We are giving you an opportunity to discuss the nature of those calls. Donaghy, I want to talk to my attorney before I say anything else. FBI agent, that is your right. We can provide you a number to call. We would advise you to contact counsel today. There will be follow-up. Donaghy, I understand. He stepped back inside the house. He closed the door. He did not return to the porch. The conversation, by every available account, lasted less than 4 minutes. There were no handcuffs that morning. There was no arrest. The Bureau did not need to make an arrest at that stage. They needed Donaghy to know that they had him. They needed him to walk back inside, sit down on his couch, look at his wife, and understand exactly what was coming. Within 48 hours, Donaghy had retained a federal defense attorney out of Philadelphia. Within a week, his lawyer was in contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn. Within 2 weeks, the news of the investigation began to leak. The New York Post broke the story first. By the time the league office in Midtown Manhattan had been formally notified, the story was already a national headline. Commissioner David Stern held a press conference at NBA headquarters on July 24, 2007. He used the phrase rogue, isolated criminal. He insisted that the integrity of the league had not been compromised at any structural level. He looked, on camera, like a man who had not slept in 3 days. Reporters in the room asked the questions every American sports fan was asking at the same moment. How many games? How many referees? How far back? How much had this man tainted? Stern could not answer those questions. The FBI was still answering them. Tim Donaghy, at that moment, was sitting in a Philadelphia law office with his lawyer, reading through the Bureau's preliminary disclosure of evidence. He was 40 years old. He had a wife and 4 daughters. He had 13 years on the NBA officiating staff, and he was being told by counsel that his only realistic path forward was a guilty plea. On August 15, 2007, Timothy Francis Donaghy walked into the federal courthouse in Brooklyn and pleaded guilty to 2 felony counts before United States District Judge Carol Bagley Amon, count 1. Conspiracy to engage in wire fraud, predicated on the honest services theory under 18 U.S.C. Section 1346. By using non-public information acquired through his employment as an NBA referee to enrich himself outside of his employer's interests, Donaghy had deprived the National Basketball Association of his honest services. Count 2. Transmitting wagering information across state lines under 18 U.S.C. Section 1084. The coded phone calls between Florida, Pennsylvania, and New York satisfied the interstate element. Both charges carried statutory maximums of 5 years apiece. The plea agreement included a cooperation provision. Donaghy would testify against Battista and Martino. He would sit for proffer sessions with the FBI. He would help the Bureau understand the full architecture of the scheme, including any information about other referees, other gamblers, and other games that he knew about. The cooperation provision was significant. The league office and the public both wanted to know whether Donaghy had been a lone actor or whether he was the visible piece of something larger. Donaghy, in his proffer sessions, maintained that he was the only NBA referee involved in the scheme. The Bureau pressed him. The Bureau pressed him repeatedly. The Bureau ultimately concluded, based on the evidence available, that no other referees were criminally implicated, although the league office's internal review would identify a range of secondary integrity issues among officials that would lead to its own institutional reforms. James Battista and Thomas Martino were indicted within weeks. Both pleaded guilty in early 2008. Battista received 15 months in federal prison. Martino received a year and a day, the minimum sentence available that would still allow good time credit. The sentencing of Tim Donaghy was scheduled for July 29, 2008 in Brooklyn. The courtroom that morning was packed. Reporters from every major sports outlet in the country. Representatives from the NBA legal department. Donaghy's wife, Kim, sitting in the second row, surrounded by extended family. His father, Jerry Donaghy, the former Big Five referee, sitting one row behind her with his hands folded in his lap. Judge Carol Bagley Amon listened to the arguments. She listened to the defense plead for leniency based on Donaghy's cooperation. She listened to the prosecution argue that Donaghy was the most culpable defendant in the conspiracy. She listened to Donaghy himself stand at the podium and read a prepared statement of apology to the NBA, to his colleagues, to the players whose games he had officiated, and to his family. Then she imposed sentence. 15 months in federal prison. 3 years of supervised release. Restitution in the amount of $217,266, payable to the National Basketball Association. The judge's statement from the bench was brief and surgical. She said, on the record, that of the 3 defendants in the conspiracy, Donaghy was the most culpable. She said, in a sentence that would be quoted in every news story written about the case for the next decade and beyond, that without Mr. Donaghy, there was no scheme. She said his crime had injured not only his direct employer, but the broader public interest in the integrity of professional sports. She said the sentence she was imposing was meant to send a signal to every official in every league in the country. Donaghy reported to FCY Pensacola, a low-security federal prison camp in the Florida Panhandle, in the late summer of 2008. He served his time. He was released in November 2009 after approximately 11 months in custody, transferred briefly to a halfway house, and then placed under federal supervision for the next 3 years. He never officiated another basketball game at any professional level. The NBA's referee development program quietly tightened its background checks, expanded its financial disclosure requirements, and implemented new monitoring protocols for the betting markets surrounding its games. Years later, in 2018, when the Supreme Court struck down the federal prohibition on state-level sports betting and the NBA began openly partnering with sportsbooks, the league's integrity protocols were rewritten yet again, and the architects of those protocols referenced the Donaghy case by name in their internal memoranda. The number that matters in this case is not the $217,000 in restitution. It is not the 15-month sentence. It is not even the 772 games he officiated during his NBA career. The number that matters is one referee, one inside source, one coded word on a phone line between Philadelphia and Florida. That was all it took to put a permanent asterisk on the integrity of an entire professional sports league. Every time a fresh NBA gambling story breaks, every time an official's call gets scrutinized in a playoff game, every time a sportsbook flags an irregular betting pattern on a Tuesday night regular season contest, his name comes back. Tim Donaghy. The cautionary tale. The man who proved that the system the entire spectator sports industry rests upon, the assumption that the people enforcing the rules do not have money on the outcome, can be broken by one man with a phone and an old high school friend. This case still haunts the league, but the case on the right-hand side of your screen is even more disturbing. Click it now.